John stared at the hospital number until it stopped ringing. For a second, he actually felt relieved. Wrong number, he told himself. It had to be. Then it rang again. His best man looked over and grinned. "You'd better answer that before your bride thinks you're getting cold feet." John forced a smile, stepped into the empty hallway, and pressed the phone to his ear. The nurse didn't ask how he was. She asked very gently, "Are you John, the father of Emma and Caleb?" He frowned. "I'm sorry. You've got the wrong man." There was a short pause, the kind people leave when they're choosing their next words carefully. Then she said, "Their mother is Mary. She was brought into the emergency room this morning. Before she lost consciousness, she listed you as their father and their emergency contact." John leaned against the wall because his knees suddenly didn't feel steady anymore. Behind the church doors, someone began playing the wedding processional. In front of him was a hospital expecting a father. Behind him was a woman waiting to become his wife. And somehow, both places believed he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Welcome to Mr. Hartley's story. To everyone who has supported this channel, thank you for being part of this incredible journey. We're growing every day, improving every day, and bringing you even better content ahead. If you're new here, comment below and tell us where you're watching from, and make sure you subscribe to officially join the family. If you had asked Mary back then whether she had time for a relationship, she probably would have laughed before answering. Most mornings started before sunrise and ended long after dark. She worked the early shift at a neighborhood diner on Savannah's west side, changed into scrubs in the restroom before heading across town for nursing classes, and picked up evening shifts as a patient care technician whenever she could. It wasn't glamorous, but it kept the lights on at home and helped her mother worry a little less about the tuition bills that kept arriving every semester. Her mother used to tell her, "People will promise you the world when life is easy. Pay attention to the ones who show up when it's inconvenient." Mary never forgot that. She didn't spend much time thinking about romance. She thought about rent, exams, and whether she could stretch one grocery trip until payday. If she ever imagined marriage, it was usually while folding laundry at midnight, wondering if there would ever be a season of life that didn't feel like catching up. Across town, John lived by routines that rarely changed. By 6 every morning, he was already on the football field, coffee in one hand and a whistle hanging around his neck. As an assistant coach at one of Savannah's respected public high schools, he wasn't chasing television interviews or championship rings. What mattered to him was watching teenagers slowly become responsible young men. He remembered birthdays. He asked about grades. He noticed when one of his players had been unusually quiet for a few days. The boys respected him because he listened before he offered advice. Outside of football, his life was equally predictable. Dinner with his parents every Wednesday, church every Sunday, calls with his older sister whenever she remembered to tease him about still being single. "You know," she joked one evening, "most people date before they're 40. John smiled. "I'm not 40. You're getting close enough for me to start worrying." "I'm fine." "You always say that." Because he believed it. His life wasn't exciting, but it felt steady. After growing up watching friends chase relationships that seemed to create more stress than happiness, he'd stopped believing love had to arrive on a schedule. The two of them might have gone years without meeting if a local youth fundraiser hadn't needed more volunteers than it expected. The event brought together teachers, coaches, nurses, church members, and local businesses to raise money for after-school programs. It wasn't the kind of place people expected their lives to change. Most came to help, eat barbecue, and head home before the afternoon heat became unbearable. Mary was helping organize donated medical supplies for a free health screening. John was directing a group of football players who had volunteered to set up folding tables. Their first conversation happened because one of those tables ended up in the wrong place. Mary looked up from unpacking blood pressure cuffs. "I actually need that one over here." John glanced across the room. "The kids' registration line starts here. So does the health screening." He smiled politely. "I was told to set them up this way. I was told something different." For a second, they simply looked at each other. Neither sounded angry. Neither wanted to give in. Finally, John laughed first. "I don't even know your name, and we're already negotiating furniture." Mary folded her arms. "I wasn't negotiating." "No? I was winning. That caught him off guard. So that's how today is going to be. She tried not to smile. Depends. On what? Whether you're planning to keep putting my tables in the wrong place. He looked down at the floor, then back at her. You know, there's a chance they're your tables. Mary finally laughed. That's the smartest thing you've said since we met. One of John's players walked past, shaking his head. Coach, did you already lose the argument? John answered without taking his eyes off Mary. I think I did. The rest of the afternoon kept pulling them into the same spaces. When the registration line grew too long, John helped direct families without being asked. When one of the younger volunteers scraped his knee unloading equipment, Mary cleaned the cut while John distracted the boy with a story about accidentally tackling the water cooler during practice his first year coaching. Near the end of the event, they found themselves standing beside the nearly empty refreshment table, each reaching for the last bottle of water. John stopped his hand. You've earned it. Mary raised an eyebrow, trying to recover from losing the table argument. I'm trying to avoid another one. She handed him the bottle instead. We can share it. It was such an ordinary moment that neither of them remembered exactly what they talked about afterward. Years later, both would remember something else instead. How easy it had felt. There was no performance, no awkward attempt to impress each other, just two tired people discovering that conversation didn't have to feel like work. Over the next few weeks, they crossed paths more often than either expected. Sometimes, it was outside the community center. Sometimes at neighborhood events. Once, Mary finished an overnight shift and walked into a small coffee shop near the hospital, only to find John already there grading player evaluations before practice. He looked up. You look exhausted. I feel worse than I look. I don't believe that. She laughed into her coffee. You're terrible at compliments. I wasn't trying to compliment you. I noticed. He hesitated, then slid one of the pastries he'd just bought across the table. You skipped breakfast. You don't know that. You looked at that pastry before you looked at me. Mary blinked. You noticed? I coach teenagers. And? They're terrible liars when they're hungry. She stared at him for another second before tearing the pastry in half. You know this doesn't mean I owe you anything. I wasn't keeping score. I am. Already? She smiled. Someone has to. When she left 20 minutes later, she realized something unusual. For the first time in weeks, she wasn't thinking about work, and John sat at the table a little longer than he needed to, watching the door close behind her, before quietly returning to his papers with a smile he didn't bother explaining to himself. After that morning at the coffee shop, neither Mary nor John made a grand decision to start dating. It happened the way some of the strongest relationships do, one ordinary choice at a time. John found himself looking to see if Mary's car was parked outside the hospital whenever he drove past after practice. Mary caught herself checking the clock around lunchtime because that was usually when John texted to ask whether she'd remembered to eat. Their conversations never followed a script. Some days they lasted 5 minutes. Other days an hour disappeared before either of them noticed. One Friday evening, John called while Mary was walking home from class. You still studying? I've been studying since 6 this morning. So, yes. She laughed. You've got jokes today. I've got pizza. Mary stopped walking. That's unfair. I know. You called on purpose. I did. You knew I hadn't eaten. I had a feeling. She looked down the quiet sidewalk before smiling to herself. Fine. Fine. I'm accepting your bribe. It wasn't a bribe. It absolutely was. It worked, though. It did. By the time she reached his truck outside her apartment building, the pizza was already getting cold because they'd spent 10 minutes talking before either of them remembered to eat. It became normal. John waited outside the hospital after Mary's overnight rotations because she admitted, once and only once, that driving home while exhausted scared her. He never mentioned it again. He simply started showing up. Some mornings, she climbed into his truck without saying much more than, "Morning." He would hand her a cup of coffee. She would take one sip. Too much sugar. I know. Then why keep making it this way? You always drink the whole thing. She rolled her eyes. That's not the point. It kind of is. She shook her head, but the cup was empty before they reached her apartment. He noticed. She noticed that he noticed. Neither said anything. Those quiet routines became the language of their relationship. There weren't dramatic declarations. There wasn't endless reassurance. There was consistency. If Mary's shift ended at 7, John was there at 7. If John had a difficult game on Friday night, Mary waited until the team buses returned before texting, knowing he hated checking his phone while the players were still around. They learned each other's rhythms without talking about them. Her mother noticed before either of them admitted they were serious. One Sunday afternoon, while Mary chopped vegetables for dinner, her mother leaned against the kitchen counter. He listens to you. Mary looked up. Who? Her mother smiled. The football coach you pretend is just your friend. Mary tried to hide a grin. We are friends. What? You smile differently when you talk about him. Mary laughed softly. I do not. You've been smiling at that cutting board for 30 seconds. Mary looked down and realized she had stopped chopping altogether. Her mother didn't tease her after that. She simply returned to stirring the pot on the stove. Some observations didn't need explaining. John's parents reached the same conclusion around the same time. Mary started appearing at Wednesday family dinners often enough that John's father eventually stopped asking if she was joining them. He simply set another plate on the table. His mother loved how easily Mary fit into conversations. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She asked questions, helped clear dishes before anyone could stop her, remembered birthdays after hearing them only once. One evening, after Mary and John left, his father looked across the living room. I haven't seen you this settled in years. John frowned. Settled? You laugh more. John looked toward the front window where Mary's car had disappeared around the corner. I guess I do. Months passed without either of them feeling rushed. They argued occasionally, usually about practical things. Mary believed John said yes too often when people needed favors. John thought Mary pushed herself too hard and rarely admitted when she needed help. Neither argument lasted very long. One Saturday afternoon, they spent nearly 3 hours assembling a bookshelf Mary had bought online. By the end, they realized it was backwards. Mary stared at it. We're not telling anyone. John folded his arms. It's leaning. I know. It's supposed to stand against a wall. I know. It's physically impossible for this shelf to hold books. Mary burst into laughter so hard she had to sit on the floor. John tried to stay serious. He lasted about 5 seconds. Eventually, they took the entire thing apart and started over. Years later, neither of them remembered how long it took to fix. They only remembered laughing until the neighbors knocked to ask if everything was all right. It wasn't a perfect relationship. Mary sometimes withdrew when she felt overwhelmed instead of asking for help. John had a habit of believing he could solve every problem if he simply worked harder. Neither recognized those habits as weaknesses yet. At the time, they simply seemed like parts of each other's personalities. Nearly 2 years after that fundraiser, John asked Mary to meet him at Forsyth Park. She arrived expecting a walk beneath the old oak trees, the same place they often came whenever life felt too busy. Instead, she found John standing beneath the hanging Spanish moss with both hands shoved awkwardly into his pockets. You look nervous, she said. I am. Why? I had a speech. You? It was a good one. What happened to it? I forgot it. Mary smiled. I believe that. He laughed once, more at himself than at the situation. I've coached football players in front of thousands of people without getting this worked up. And now? Now I can't remember a single sentence. She stepped closer. You don't need one. John reached into his pocket, pulled out a small ring box, and looked at her the way he always did when he wanted her full attention. I don't have a perfect speech, he admitted. I only know that every version of my future I picture has you somewhere in it. I don't want to build a life you aren't part of. Mary covered her mouth before he could finish opening the box. Her eyes had already filled. She nodded once, then again. Yes. He blinked. I didn't even ask yet. I know, but my answer isn't changing. She wrapped both arms around him before he finished the question he'd spent weeks rehearsing. A tourist walking past offered to take their picture. Neither of them noticed. They were too busy laughing through happy tears that neither had expected to come so quickly. As they walked back through the park, still holding hands, they passed a modest brick house with a weathered front porch and bicycles leaning against the neighbor's fence. John slowed. "I like that one." Mary looked at the peeling paint. "It needs work. It has good bones. It has about 300 weekends of work." He grinned. "So, you're saying there's potential?" She bumped his shoulder. "I'm saying, if we ever buy a house like that, you're doing most of the painting." He pretended to think about it. "Deal." Neither of them realized they had already started talking about children as though they were only a matter of time. Neither imagined how fragile even the safest dreams could be. For a while, life unfolded exactly the way Mary and John had hoped it would. Not perfectly, just steadily. Wedding plans lived in a folder on Mary's kitchen table. They hadn't picked flowers yet, and the guest list kept changing because every week someone remembered another cousin or church friend who absolutely had to be invited. John teased that half of Savannah would end up at the ceremony if they weren't careful. Mary told him that was his fault. "You've coached 3 generations of this city." "I have not." "You coached one player's father." "That happened once. And now, he wants to bring his whole family." John smiled. "I guess I can't complain." She reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "No, you really can't." The wedding could wait. What mattered more to both of them was what came after. One rainy Saturday, they spent the afternoon driving through neighborhoods, slowing whenever they saw a modest house with a "for sale" sign in the yard. John carried a small notebook in the glove compartment. Mary discovered it by accident. "What is this?" He reached over, trying to take it back. "Nothing." She opened it anyway. Every page held sketches, room measurements, kitchen ideas, lists titled "Things We Can Fix Ourselves." Another page simply read, "Backyard big enough for kids." Mary looked at him. "You've been planning this without telling me?" "I wasn't planning." She held up the notebook. "This looks suspiciously like planning." He rubbed the back of his neck. "I just like thinking ahead." She smiled as she turned another page. One sketch showed a small porch swing. Another had shelves built into a living room wall. Near the back of the notebook, she found 3 words written inside a rough drawing of a bedroom. "Baby's first room." John noticed where her eyes had stopped. "I wrote that months ago. You never showed me." "I wasn't sure it would ever matter." She closed the notebook and rested it on her lap. "It matters." Neither of them realized they were sitting in a parked truck outside a house they couldn't afford, smiling at plans that suddenly felt closer than either had expected. A few weeks later, Mary stood alone in the bathroom of the hospital where she worked, staring at 2 pink lines. She looked at them again, then again, as if waiting for them to disappear. They didn't. Her first thought wasn't excitement. It was math. Tuition, rent, wedding deposits, student loans. She sat on the closed toilet lid, holding the test in one hand while trying to slow her breathing. When her shift ended, she drove to the football field instead of going home. Practice had just finished. Players jogged toward the locker room while coaches gathered equipment. John spotted her almost immediately. He smiled, then stopped smiling. Something in her face had changed. He walked over. "You okay?" Mary nodded too quickly. "Can we talk?" Without another question, he led her toward the empty bleachers. They sat in silence for a moment. She kept looking at the small paper bag in her hands. Finally, she passed it to him. "I didn't know how else to tell you." John frowned, reached inside, and pulled out the pregnancy test. For several seconds, he simply stared at it. Mary couldn't read his expression. She had prepared herself for surprise, for worry, maybe even panic. Instead, he looked back at her with eyes already filling. "Mary." She hurried to speak before he could. "I know the timing isn't great. We haven't finished paying for the wedding. I still have another year before—" He laughed. It came out somewhere between a sob and a grin. Then he stood, pulled her into his arms so suddenly she barely had time to react, and held her tightly enough that she started laughing too. "We're having a baby." She smiled against his shoulder. "You skipped right past asking if I'm okay." He pulled back immediately. "Are you okay?" "I think so." "You think so?" "I've had about 4 hours to process this." "I've had about 4 seconds." She watched him wipe at one eye before pretending he hadn't. "Were you just crying?" "No. You absolutely were. There was dust." "On the football field?" "It was aggressive dust." She laughed again. "I can't believe I'm marrying you. I can't believe you're having my baby." The words settled between them. Real, unexpected, beautiful. On the drive home, John was already talking out loud. "I can coach another summer camp." Mary looked over. "What?" "That extra income. You've already started budgeting? We'll need a bigger emergency fund." "John." "And maybe we postpone the honeymoon." She reached over and rested her hand on his arm. "You don't have to solve everything today." "I know." He smiled without taking his eyes off the road. "I just want you to know we're doing this together." She believed him. Completely. For the next few months, they settled into a different rhythm. Doctor's appointments replaced weekend trips. John downloaded parenting podcasts he secretly listened to on the drive to work. Mary caught him reading articles with titles like "How to Install a Car Seat Correctly Months Before They Would Ever Need One." She never teased him. Much. Then football season arrived. The school wasn't expected to contend for a regional title that year. But something clicked. The team kept winning. Every victory brought another week of practice, another playoff game, another film session that stretched late into the night. The head coach began hinting that John was being considered for a promotion. "It's a good thing," Mary told him one evening while they ate takeout at her apartment. "I know. You don't sound convinced." He looked at the schedule spread across the table. "I'm going to miss more than I want to." "You'll make time." "I'll try." He meant it. He truly did. But trying and succeeding slowly became different things. Dinner plans moved from Wednesday to Thursday, then to Friday, then to next week. Sometimes John called from the school parking lot. "I'm sorry. We just finished reviewing game film." Mary would smile, even though he couldn't see it. "It's okay." Other times Mary came home from 12-hour shifts, too exhausted to do anything except shower and fall asleep before he called. Neither complained, neither accused. Both kept believing the busy season would pass. What neither of them noticed was that they had stopped sharing the small parts of their days, the ordinary conversations, the tiny frustrations, the little victories. Those were the first things to disappear. Then, late one evening, while John was traveling with the team for an away playoff game, Mary's phone slipped from her hand as she stood in the hospital hallway. A sharp pain spread across her abdomen. She grabbed the wall. Another pain followed. A fellow nurse saw her face and was beside her almost immediately. "Mary?" She tried to answer. Instead, she bent forward, one hand protecting her stomach. Within minutes, she wasn't helping patients anymore. She was one. As doctors rushed her toward an examination room, she reached for her phone with shaking hands. John. She needed John. She called. The call never connected. She left a voicemail, then another, and another. Hours later, lying in a hospital bed with monitors softly beeping around her, she stared at her silent phone. No missed calls, no messages, no sign that John even knew where she was. She didn't know his phone had been crushed beneath equipment during the away game and was sitting, useless, in a repair shop back in Savannah. John, hundreds of miles away, had no idea the woman he loved was lying in a hospital room, waiting for him. And Mary, listening to the silence between each unanswered call, slowly began to wonder if something had changed that neither of them had found the words to say. Mary spent 3 days in the hospital. The doctors eventually gave her the news she had been hoping for. The pregnancy complication had stabilized. The baby was still doing well. She would need to take things much more carefully, but she could go home. Everyone around her seemed relieved. She wasn't. Every few hours, she picked up her phone. Nothing. She replayed John's voicemail greeting once, hoping she'd somehow missed a message. Nothing. The nurses noticed. One of them smiled gently. "Your fiancé must be worried sick." Mary forced a smile. "I'm sure he is." She wanted to believe that. She truly did. On the afternoon she was discharged, she sat alone beside the hospital window while waiting for paperwork. Outside, families climbed into cars. Visitors hugged patients goodbye. Life continued. Her own phone remained silent on the chair beside her. She stared at it for a long time before finally slipping it into her purse. Maybe football was still keeping him busy. Maybe his phone had died. Maybe. The explanations became harder to believe each hour. A light knock interrupted her thoughts. She looked up. John's mother stood in the doorway, holding a small paper bag. "I hope I'm not interrupting." Mary straightened. "No, please, come in." John's mother smiled warmly as she crossed the room. "I brought soup from church. You always liked Mrs. Parker's chicken soup." Mary laughed softly. "I did. And I figured hospital food wasn't helping." It wasn't. She placed the bag on the bedside table and sat down. For a few minutes, they talked about ordinary things. The weather, church, the football team making another playoff round. John's mother filled the quiet, the way kind people often do when they aren't sure what someone needs. Finally, she looked at Mary's hospital bracelet. "I heard you had a scare." Mary nodded. "It frightened me more than I expected." "I can imagine." Another silence settled between them. John's mother folded her hands together. "I hope you know how much John loves you." Mary looked up immediately. "I do. I've never seen him care about anyone the way he cares about you." Mary smiled. "So why do I feel like there's a but coming?" The older woman hesitated. "There isn't a but." She looked toward the window before continuing. "I suppose I'm worried." "About what?" "Everything happening so fast." Mary waited. John's mother chose her words carefully. "You know how hard he's worked for this coaching career." "I do. And this season, well. She smiled with quiet pride. "They're already talking about promoting him." Mary nodded again. "He deserves it." "He does." Another pause. "I only wonder whether he's carrying more than anyone realizes." Mary felt something tighten inside her chest. "What do you mean?" "I don't mean you." The older woman answered almost immediately. "I hope you know that." Mary stayed quiet. "I only mean—" She sighed. "Marriage, a baby, a promotion, a mortgage one day. It's a lot for one young man all at once." Mary looked down at the blanket covering her legs. John's mother reached across and gently touched her hand. "He's the kind of person who says yes to everyone." "I know. He'll carry every burden himself before asking for help." Mary swallowed. "I know. I worry he'll exhaust himself trying to make everyone happy." She squeezed Mary's hand once before letting go. "I don't want him to lose himself." The room fell silent again. John's mother believed she had expressed concern for her son. Mary heard something entirely different. She heard, "He's already carrying too much." She heard, "Your child might become one more responsibility he never asked for." She heard, "If you love him, don't make him choose." None of those sentences had actually been spoken. But fear has a way of finishing conversations that never happened. John's mother stood. "I should let you get home." Mary smiled politely. "Thank you for coming." She hugged her before leaving. At the door, she turned back. "Tell John to stop living at the football field." Mary managed a small laugh. "I will." The door closed. The room became still. Mary stared at the soup on the bedside table for several minutes without opening it. When she finally stood, she reached for her engagement ring. Her thumb rested against it. She didn't take it off. Not yet. But for the first time since John had proposed beneath the oak trees, she allowed herself to imagine a future where loving him might mean walking away before he felt trapped. It wasn't a decision. Not yet. It was only a thought. Unfortunately, some thoughts become plans long before we admit they're growing. Mary went back to the apartment they had slowly begun filling with wedding magazines, unopened gifts from relatives, and a future that suddenly felt uncertain. Nothing looked different. That somehow made it worse. John's jacket was still hanging over the back of a dining chair because he'd rushed out to practice 2 weeks earlier and forgotten it. His running shoes were by the front door. A grocery list they'd started together was still held to the refrigerator with a magnet from the county fair. Milk, eggs, laundry detergent, baby books. She stood in the kitchen longer than she meant to. Everything in the apartment suggested two people were building a life together. She no longer knew if that was true. Over the next 3 days, she tried calling John again. The calls went straight to voicemail. She left shorter messages this time. "Hi, it's me. I got home. I know you're busy. Just call when you can." By the 4th day, she stopped leaving messages. She still called. She simply listened to his greeting and hung up. Each unanswered call made the silence feel more intentional than the last. She had no way of knowing John's replacement phone had not yet arrived. The damaged one sat in a repair shop, its screen shattered beyond use after equipment had shifted during the team's trip home from the playoff game. John, meanwhile, borrowed phones whenever he could. He called Mary's number more than once. Sometimes it rang without an answer. Sometimes it went directly to voicemail. He frowned each time. "That's strange," he muttered to the head coach one evening. "What is?" "Mary, everything okay?" "I don't know." The coach looked at him for a moment. "You've got tomorrow morning off. Go see her." "I will." He meant it. But before morning came, the school called an emergency staff meeting after the head coach's father suffered a stroke. Practice schedules changed. Media interviews had to be rearranged. Parents needed updates. One responsibility became another. By the time John finally drove toward Mary's apartment 2 evenings later, the parking space outside her building was empty. He knocked anyway. No answer. He tried again. Still nothing. Mrs. Alvarez, the elderly neighbor across the hall, opened her door. "You looking for Mary?" "Yeah. I haven't seen her since the hospital." John's expression changed. "The hospital?" She blinked. "You didn't know?" His stomach tightened. "No." Mrs. Alvarez frowned, realizing she had assumed something that wasn't true. "I thought supper—" She stopped herself. "I'm sorry. I thought you'd been with her." John thanked her, got back into his truck, and drove straight to the hospital. Privacy rules kept the staff from telling him much, only that Mary had already been discharged. No forwarding address, no additional information. He left more confused than when he arrived. That same night, across town, Mary sat at her mother's dining table with a blank sheet of paper in front of her. She started writing, stopped, crumpled the page, started again. The third attempt became the letter. She didn't accuse him. She didn't ask where he'd been. She didn't even write about the hurt of waiting alone in the hospital. Instead, she wrote about the life they had planned. She told him about the pregnancy, about the complications, about his mother's visit. She admitted she might have misunderstood what had been said, but she couldn't ignore what she'd felt while lying in that hospital bed with no word from him. Then she wrote the sentence that took the longest. "I still love you." She stared at those 4 words for several minutes before continuing. "That's why I'm leaving." She explained that she needed to stand on her own feet before asking anyone else to carry responsibility for her and their child. She believed that if he truly wanted this family after time had passed, life would give them another chance. If not, she wanted him to remember her without guilt. She folded the pages carefully, placed them into an envelope, wrote his name in the neat handwriting he always recognized from birthday cards and grocery lists. The next morning she mailed it before she could change her mind. Then she packed. There wasn't much to take. Clothes, nursing textbooks, family photographs, the notebook where she'd written baby names. She paused when she reached the small box holding her engagement ring. Her mother stood quietly in the bedroom doorway. "You don't have to do this today." Mary closed the box. "If I wait—" She couldn't finish. Her mother crossed the room. "Are you sure this is what you want?" Mary looked around the apartment one last time. "No." "Then why leave?" "Because wanting something and believing it's right aren't always the same thing." Her mother didn't argue. She simply wrapped her daughter in a long embrace. Sometimes the people who love us most recognize that advice has reached its limit. The moving truck pulled away just after lunch. By evening, Mary was gone from Savannah. 2 days later, heavy rain overwhelmed a regional postal distribution center. Water seeped into sorting containers before workers could move everything to higher ground. Hundreds of letters were damaged beyond delivery. Among them was a white envelope addressed to John. He checked his mailbox every afternoon that week. Nothing arrived. Mary checked hers in the small town where she had rented a modest apartment, expecting a reply. None came. John believed she had disappeared without a word. Mary believed he had read every page she wrote and chosen silence. Neither knew that, for less than the price of a postage stamp, the truth had been left floating in rainwater on the floor of a warehouse. The town Mary chose was less than an hour outside Savannah, close enough that the streets still felt familiar, far enough that nobody asked why a young woman in her 20s had arrived alone, visibly pregnant, wearing an engagement ring she gradually stopped wearing. She rented a small one-bedroom apartment above a family-owned pharmacy. The paint in the hallway was fading, the floors creaked in certain spots, and the kitchen barely had enough room for 2 people to stand side by side. To Mary, it felt like something even more valuable, a place where she could begin again. She found work at a community clinic before the twins were born. The pay wasn't remarkable, but the staff treated one another like neighbors instead of co-workers. When her pregnancy made long shifts difficult, the clinic manager adjusted her schedule without making her feel guilty. "We'll figure it out," he told her. Those words almost made her cry. Months later, on a cool spring morning, Emma arrived first. Caleb followed 7 minutes later. The nurse laughed as she placed the babies beside Mary. "You've got your hands full." Mary looked at them for what felt like forever. "I've got my whole heart full." In the quiet hours after they were born, she thought about calling John. She even picked up her phone. His number was still there. She stared at it until the screen went dark. Then she put the phone back on the bedside table. Nothing had changed. No letter, no reply, no explanation. She kissed both babies on their foreheads and whispered something neither of them would remember. "You already have a father who would have loved you." She stopped herself. Not would have. She closed her eyes. "Who loves you?" Even then, she couldn't bring herself to speak badly about him. As Emma and Caleb grew, John became a familiar presence inside their home without ever walking through the front door. Not through photographs. Mary kept those packed away, but through stories. When Caleb insisted on thanking the grocery store cashier by name, Mary smiled. "Your dad used to do that." When Emma carefully folded napkins before family dinners, Mary laughed softly. "I've seen that before." The children naturally became curious. "Where is Daddy?" Emma asked one evening when she was 5. Mary stopped stirring the spaghetti sauce. She took a slow breath before turning around. "He lives in another town." "Does he know us?" Mary thought about the question longer than Emma understood. "I don't know." "Is he mean?" "No." The answer came immediately. "He was one of the kindest people I've ever known." Caleb looked up from coloring at the table. "Then why doesn't he come here?" Mary walked over and knelt beside both children. Sometimes good people get separated because they don't know the whole story. Emma frowned. "Like when you think somebody took your toy but they didn't?" Mary smiled. "Something like that." It wasn't the whole truth. It wasn't a lie either. Back in Savannah, John refused to believe Mary had simply vanished. He searched with the determination of someone who couldn't accept an ending that made no sense. He drove to her old apartment more times than he cared to admit. Each visit ended the same way. Different tenants, different cars, no answers. He contacted mutual friends, church members, former classmates from nursing school. Nobody knew where she had gone. Or if they did, they respected the privacy of a woman who had clearly wanted a fresh start. John even revisited neighborhoods where they had once imagined buying a house. One afternoon, he parked outside the modest brick home they had laughed about after getting engaged. The "for sale" sign was gone. Children's bicycles leaned against the porch. Someone else's family lived there now. He stayed only a minute before driving away. The notebook filled with renovation ideas remained tucked inside the glove compartment of his truck. He couldn't bring himself to throw it away. Months slowly became years. His coaching career kept moving. He accepted more responsibility. Then the promotion finally came. Assistant coach became head coach. Parents trusted him. Players respected him. The school celebrated him. The local newspaper ran a story calling him one of the region's most respected young football coaches. His mother clipped the article and placed it in a scrapbook. John thanked her, then quietly changed the subject. Success had arrived. It simply hadn't arrived with the life he thought he'd be living. Time did what time usually does. It softened sharp edges without erasing them. People stopped asking what had happened to Mary. The questions disappeared. The wondering never completely did. Then, almost 8 years later, John's sister invited him to a church fundraiser. He almost didn't go. "I've got film to watch," he told her. "You've always got film to watch." "I'm busy." She folded her arms. "No, you're hiding." He looked away. "I don't know what you're talking about. You haven't been on a date in years." "I've been working." "You've also been lonely." He sighed. "I don't need a lecture." "I'm not giving you one." She smiled. "I'm introducing you to someone." He groaned. "Please don't." Too late. That evening, he met Rebecca. She wasn't loud. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She volunteered with the church literacy program, taught 3rd grade, and had a calm way of listening that reminded John of something he'd once thought he had lost forever. Their first conversation lasted less than 20 minutes. When it ended, neither of them tried to force another one. A week later, she called, "Would you like to get coffee sometime?" John hesitated, long enough that Rebecca noticed. "If you're not ready, that's okay." He looked through the windshield of his truck before answering, "No." "Oh," he took a slow breath. "I think I am." He believed it when he said it. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to imagine that maybe moving forward wasn't the same thing as forgetting. He had no way of knowing that the past had never stopped moving toward him too. By the time Emma and Caleb turned 8, Mary had become an expert at answering difficult questions without letting her own sadness answer them first. Most days, it wasn't difficult. Life was busy enough to keep everyone moving. School mornings began with misplaced shoes, unfinished homework, and Caleb insisting he could find everything himself before asking his sister where his backpack was. Emma was the organized one. She packed lunches, checked calendars, reminded Mary which library books were due. Caleb noticed people. Emma noticed details. Watching them grow often felt like watching pieces of 2 different lives learning to share the same home. One Saturday morning, Mary found Caleb standing at the kitchen sink, carefully rinsing his cereal bowl before putting it in the dishwasher. "You don't have to wash it first," she said. "I know. Then why are you doing it?" He shrugged. "It feels polite." Mary smiled before she could stop herself. John used to do the same thing. He insisted dishes should never be left looking like someone else had to finish your job. She had never taught Caleb that, not intentionally. A week later, Emma carefully folded cloth napkins before Sunday dinner at Mary's mother's house. Her grandmother laughed. "Where did you learn that?" Emma looked surprised by the question. "I don't know." Mary looked away for a second. She knew. Some habits survive in stories. The children had grown up hearing about their father, the same way other families talked about relatives who lived far away. Never as a mystery. Never as a villain. Simply as someone life had somehow carried in another direction. Mary never kept a photograph on display. Not because she wanted to erase him. Because she didn't want the children growing up staring at the face of someone they couldn't know. Instead, they knew his character. He always thanked restaurant servers. He never forgot birthdays. He thought people deserved your full attention when they were talking. Small things, the kind children quietly absorb. One evening, while Mary helped Emma with a science project, Caleb wandered into the kitchen holding an old Father's Day card he'd made at school. It had never been given to anyone. "Dad's Day Breakfast," he'd written across the front in oversized blue letters. He held it out to Mary. "Can I ask you something?" She set the scissors down. "Of course. If Dad knocked on our door." He looked toward the front window. "Would you let him in?" Mary didn't answer immediately. She reached for the card instead. ran her thumb gently across the uneven handwriting. Yes. You would? I would. Caleb frowned. Even after all this time? Mary nodded. I've never been angry with your father. Emma looked up from the table. Then why didn't he come? Mary leaned back in her chair. I wish I knew. It wasn't the answer either child wanted, but it was the truest one she had. Across Savannah, John was learning that beginning again didn't happen all at once. Rebecca never asked him to forget Mary. She seemed to understand that some losses don't disappear simply because enough years have passed. One evening after dinner, they walked through Forsyth Park carrying coffee instead of umbrellas. Rebecca glanced toward the old oak trees. You've been here before. John smiled. Many times. With her? He looked ahead. Yes. Rebecca waited. When he didn't continue, she spoke softly. You don't have to pretend parts of your life never happened because I'm here. John looked at her, surprised. Does that bother you? She shook her head. No. What if it always stays part of me? I think it probably will. She smiled, though there was sadness in it. We're all loved by people who've lived whole lives before we arrived. John laughed quietly. I've never heard anyone explain it like that. My parents were married 38 years. And? My dad used to say mature love isn't about being someone's first chapter. She slipped her hand into his. It's about writing a good chapter after the difficult ones. John squeezed her hand gently. For the first time in a long time, the future didn't feel like something he had to force himself toward. It felt possible, not because the past had disappeared, because someone had stopped asking him to outrun it. The months that followed were quieter than either John or Rebecca expected. There were no dramatic declarations, no whirlwind romance. Their relationship grew through ordinary Saturdays, shared grocery trips, church dinners, and long conversations that sometimes wandered from childhood memories to school budgets, before ending with neither of them remembering how the subject had changed. Rebecca taught third grade at a nearby elementary school. She had a habit of bringing work home, spreading spelling tests across her dining room table, and grading them with a mug of tea that always went cold before she finished. John teased her about it. You know they make insulated mugs. I have one. Then why don't you use it? She looked up without stopping her red pen. Because I keep forgetting where I put it. The next week, John showed up with another insulated mug. Rebecca laughed. I already own one. I know, so why buy another? Now you've got 2 chances to remember. She shook her head. You're impossible. I've heard that before. Little moments like that slowly replaced the silence that had lived in John's life for years. Not erased it, shared it. Rebecca never filled every quiet space. She seemed comfortable sitting beside him on the porch without needing conversation. John found that strangely comforting. One evening, after helping his parents replace a broken fence post, he drove Rebecca home. She didn't get out of the truck right away. Instead, she looked at the small velvet box resting on the dashboard. You've been carrying that around for 3 days. John smiled nervously. I was waiting for the right moment. And when is that? I thought I'd know. She looked out through the windshield. The truth? He nodded. I don't care if it's here. She turned back toward him. I care why. John let out a slow breath. I spent a long time thinking I wasn't allowed to imagine another future. Rebecca reached across the center console and took his hand. I'm not asking you to replace your past. I know. I'm asking whether you want me in your future. He looked at her for a long moment before opening the box. The ring was simple, nothing extravagant, exactly the kind of choice Rebecca would have made herself. Rebecca. He smiled, almost embarrassed. I wrote a speech. She laughed. Did you lose it? I think I did. Good. She squeezed his hand. I like the honest version better. John looked down at the ring, then back at her. I don't know everything life is going to bring. She smiled. Nobody does. But I know I'd like to face it with you. Rebecca nodded before he finished. Yes. He laughed. I hadn't actually asked. I know. You're making this a habit. She leaned over and kissed his cheek. "I thought I'd save you the trouble." Their engagement wasn't announced with fireworks or elaborate celebrations. It spread through family phone calls, church conversations, and congratulatory hugs after Sunday service. John's mother cried. His father shook his hand before pulling him into a hug. His sister whispered, "It's about time." Life kept moving. Wedding plans began again. Different church, different invitations, different future. Across town, Mary's life was changing too, though not in ways she had expected. At first, it was easy to dismiss. She felt more tired than usual after long shifts. She blamed work. Then came the headaches. She blamed stress. A few weeks later, she noticed herself sitting down between patients more often than she ever had before. One afternoon, another nurse watched Mary steady herself against the medication cart. "You okay?" Mary smiled automatically. "Skipped lunch." "You always skip lunch." "I'll eat when I get home." The nurse frowned but didn't push. At home, Emma noticed something different before anyone else. "You've been falling asleep on the couch." Mary looked up from the blanket she'd pulled over herself. "Have the first?" "3 times this week." Caleb walked into the room carrying his homework. "And you forgot spaghetti yesterday." Mary laughed. "I made spaghetti." "No." He grinned. "You boiled noodles." She covered her face with one hand. "I forgot the sauce." The children laughed. She laughed with them. It felt easier than admitting she'd stood in the kitchen the night before staring at an open cabinet because, for a moment, she couldn't remember what she'd gone there to get. A week later, her mother stopped by after work. One look at Mary's face made her set her purse down without taking off her coat. "When's your doctor's appointment?" Mary looked up from folding laundry. "What appointment?" "The one you're pretending you don't need." "I'm fine." "You've lost weight." "I've been busy." "You've been pale for months." Mary continued folding shirts. "I'm tired." Her mother sat beside her. "Mary." No answer. "Look at me." Mary finally did. "You taught your children that taking care of people means noticing when something's wrong." She reached over and took her daughter's hand. "So why are you pretending not to notice yourself?" Mary looked away. "I don't have time to be sick." Her mother's expression softened. Life doesn't usually ask whether it's convenient. The appointment was scheduled for the following week. Mary went alone. She told the children it was a routine checkup. She told herself the same thing. But as she sat in the waiting room watching the clock tick toward her name being called, she couldn't shake the feeling that 2 lives, separated for nearly 8 years, were moving toward each other again. Neither of them knew it yet, but they already shared the same countdown. The doctor didn't try to soften it with reassuring smiles. He closed the file, rested both hands on the desk, and looked directly at Mary. "We've found something that needs immediate treatment." Mary sat very still. "What kind of treatment?" "I'd like to admit you for more testing today." "After that?" He paused. "There's a strong possibility you'll need surgery." She heard the words. She simply couldn't organize them. "Surgery?" He nodded. "The good news is we found it before waiting any longer. The difficult part is that we shouldn't wait now." Mary glanced toward the window. Children were walking past the medical office with backpacks almost as big as they were. School had just let out. Emma would be asking whether they could stop for ice cream after homework. Caleb would probably leave his sneakers in the hallway again. Life outside the window hadn't changed. Inside the room, everything had. How long would I be in the hospital? It depends on what we find during the procedure. And if... She stopped. The doctor waited. "If something goes wrong?" He answered honestly. "That's why we prepare for every possibility." Mary nodded once. She had spent years working in healthcare. She recognized the careful language. Doctors didn't talk about paperwork unless they believed it mattered. 2 days later, she was admitted. She packed lightly. A change of clothes, a toothbrush, her phone charger. Emma slipped a folded drawing into her overnight bag while pretending not to. Mary found it after the children had gone to school. It showed 3 stick figures holding hands beneath a bright yellow sun. Across the top, in uneven handwriting, Emma had written, "Come home soon, Mom." Mary folded the picture carefully and placed it inside her wallet. That afternoon, a hospital social worker entered her room carrying a clipboard. "We need to complete your emergency contact forms." Mary nodded. Most of the questions were simple: address, insurance, medications, family history. Then the woman reached the final page. "If you're unable to make medical decisions temporarily, who should we contact regarding the children?" "My mother." The social worker wrote it down. "And their legal guardian if she becomes unavailable?" Mary answered without hesitation. "My sister." The woman continued writing. Then she asked the question Mary had spent 8 years avoiding. "The children's father?" Mary looked at the blank line. The room became very quiet. The social worker waited patiently. "If he's living, we should include him." Mary lowered her eyes. "He is. Would you like to list him?" Her fingers tightened around the pen. For a moment, she considered leaving the line blank. It would be easier, cleaner, no awkward explanations, no reopening a life that had been closed for years. She stared at the empty space instead. Then she remembered Caleb asking whether she would let his father through the front door. She remembered Emma folding napkins exactly the way John used to. She remembered the notebook filled with drawings of a house and a nursery. Most of all, she remembered the man who had once waited outside the hospital after every overnight shift because he didn't like the idea of her driving home exhausted. She had never stopped believing that man existed. Even after everything, she picked up the pen. Slowly, she wrote, "John Carter." The social worker looked up. "Would you like to include his phone number?" Mary knew it by heart. She always had. She recited it quietly. The woman copied it onto the form. "Is there anything you'd like us to tell him if we need to call?" Mary thought for a long moment. Finally, she shook her head. "No." The social worker smiled kindly. "Hopefully we won't need to." "I hope not." After she left, Mary remained sitting upright in the hospital bed. She looked at the completed paperwork resting on the bedside table. For 8 years she had lived with the consequences of one decision. This one felt different. She wasn't asking John to come back. She wasn't asking him to forgive her. She wasn't even expecting him to answer if the phone ever rang. She simply couldn't leave this world, if the worst happened, without giving him the chance to know the children who had carried pieces of him all their lives. The following morning, the admissions clerk reviewed the paperwork one last time before scanning it into the hospital's emergency system. Another routine task, another ordinary click of a keyboard. No one in the office knew the name on that form belonged to a man who would be standing at the front of a church in just a few days, adjusting his tie and preparing to promise the rest of his life to someone else. And no one, not Mary, not the hospital staff, not even John, could have imagined that a single phone call was already making its way toward him. John woke before his alarm. For a few seconds he forgot what day it was. Then he saw the garment bag hanging from the closet door. Wedding day. His phone already held a string of messages. His father reminding him not to forget the marriage license. His sister asking if he'd eaten breakfast. His best man sending a picture of the church with the caption, "Too late to run now." John smiled and typed back, "I'm already here." The church was only beginning to fill when he arrived. Flores moved quietly between rows of pews, making small adjustments to arrangements no one else would notice. Family members hugged in the foyer. Someone from the church kitchen hurried past, carrying trays of pastries for the bridal party. It felt like every other wedding morning he'd ever attended. Busy, happy, ordinary. Rebecca was getting ready in another part of the building. They had agreed not to see each other before the ceremony. John liked that idea. There was comfort in letting one tradition stay untouched. His best man finished straightening his tie and stepped back. "There." John looked in the mirror. "You've done this before." "I've fixed your tie before." "I meant weddings." His friend laughed. "Not my own." A knock came at the door. "5 minutes," someone called from the hallway. His best man nodded. "We've got time." John reached for the boutonniere resting on the table. His phone vibrated. An unfamiliar number. Savannah Regional Medical Center. He frowned. Probably the wrong number. It stopped, then rang again, almost immediately. His best man looked over. "You'd better answer it. Hospitals don't usually call twice unless somebody keeps ignoring them." John let out a small breath. I'll be right back. He stepped into the hallway and answered, while walking toward a quieter corner near the fellowship hall. Hello? A woman's voice came through, calm but urgent. Is this John Carter? Yes. My name is Denise. I'm a nurse at Savannah Regional Medical Center. John glanced toward the sanctuary doors. I'm sorry. I think you may have the wrong. She interrupted gently. Sir, are you the father of Emma and Caleb? John stopped walking. I'm what? The father of Emma and Caleb. He frowned. I think you've got the wrong person. There was a brief silence. Paper shuffled on the other end. Then the nurse spoke again. Their mother listed you as both their emergency contact and their father before emergency surgery. John leaned against the wall. I don't have children. I'm sorry. The nurse's voice softened. The mother's name is Mary. Everything inside him went still, not because he believed her, because he couldn't. There are a lot of people named Mary. I understand. The nurse looked back at the chart. Date of birth. She read it aloud. It was Mary's. Exactly. The hallway suddenly felt too small. John closed his eyes. No. The word escaped before he realized he'd spoken. Sir? He pressed one hand against the wall. There has to be some mistake. I wish I could tell you there was. The nurse continued carefully. Miss Williams underwent emergency surgery this morning. She's currently unconscious in recovery. The children's grandmother is driving from another county, but there may be several hours before she arrives. You're listed as the only other person authorized to make decisions if necessary. John couldn't find an answer. 8 years. 8 years without hearing her name spoken aloud, and now it had arrived from a stranger who was asking him to be a father. Not someday. Today, the church organ began warming up inside the sanctuary. Guests were taking their seats. His best man appeared at the end of the hallway. There you are. He smiled. They're ready. John looked at him, but didn't answer. His friend walked closer. What happened? John lowered the phone slowly. He looked toward the sanctuary, then toward the church doors leading outside. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. His best man frowned. John? Finally he spoke. I have to go. What? I have to leave. The ceremony starts in less than an hour. I know. Rebecca's waiting. John looked down at the phone still resting in his hand. So are 2 children who apparently think I'm their father. His friend stared at him. Neither of them moved. The church bells began ringing across the parking lot. John slipped past him, still holding the phone, and walked quickly toward the front entrance. No explanation, no plan, only one certainty. Whatever waited at that hospital had already changed the rest of his life. The drive to Savannah Regional should have taken 20 minutes. John couldn't remember any of it afterward. He stopped at red lights because he had to. He signaled before changing lanes because years of habit took over. Beyond that, the trip blurred into pieces. The nurse's voice. Are you the father of Emma and Caleb? Mary's name, the date of birth. 8 years. By the time he reached the hospital parking garage, he had convinced himself of only one thing. There had to be another explanation. Maybe Mary had listed him because she couldn't think of anyone else. Maybe the children belonged to someone who had died. Maybe. He stopped chasing possibilities as soon as the automatic doors slid open. The smell of antiseptic hit him first. Then the familiar sounds of monitors, footsteps, and distant conversations. The nurse at the reception desk looked up. John Carter? He nodded. I'm Denise. She came around the desk instead of pointing him somewhere. Thank you for coming. John looked past her toward the elevators. Where's Mary? They're bringing her into recovery. Can I see her? Not yet. He swallowed. The children? Denise hesitated. They've been waiting. She led him down a quiet hallway toward the pediatric family lounge. They've been incredibly brave, she said. Their grandmother is on her way, but traffic's been slower than expected. John barely heard the rest. Denise stopped outside a partially open door. They're inside. She stepped back, giving him space. John rested one hand on the doorframe before looking in. A little boy sat on the floor with his back against the couch. A girl, who looked a few minutes older only because she was sitting straighter, was reading from a dog-eared chapter book. Neither child noticed him at first. The television was on with the sound muted. The waiting room felt unusually calm. Then the boy looked up. His eyes met John's. He nudged his sister. Emma. She lowered the book. Both children stood politely. Not frightened, not excited, simply uncertain. John stepped inside. "Hi." The girl answered first. "Hi." He looked toward Denise, hoping she might somehow explain what he was supposed to say next. She quietly closed the door behind him. Now they were alone. John cleared his throat. He stopped. The words wouldn't come. Emma solved the problem for him. "You're John." He blinked. "Yes. My mom said you'd know our names if you ever came." His chest tightened. Caleb tilted his head. "You look younger than I thought." Emma immediately nudged him. "That's rude." It wasn't rude. It kind of was. John smiled before he realized he was doing it. "It's okay." Caleb shrugged. "I thought dads were older." John laughed once. "I guess that's fair." The room relaxed by one small degree. Emma carefully closed her book and placed it on the table. "We're sorry you had to come." John frowned. "Sorry? We know today is your wedding." He stared at her. "How do you know that?" She looked embarrassed. "Mom told the nurse." John looked toward the floor. Even lying in a hospital bed, Mary had been thinking about the life he was supposed to be living today. No anger, no demands, only consideration. Caleb climbed onto the couch. "Mom said you didn't know about us." John looked at him slowly. "No. She said it wasn't your fault." The sentence landed harder than anything else that morning. John sat in the chair across from them because his legs suddenly felt unreliable. For a few moments, no one spoke. Then a volunteer arrived carrying paper lunch bags. "Turkey sandwiches today." Emma accepted hers with both hands. "Thank you, Miss Helen." "So polite," the volunteer said with a smile before leaving. John watched the exchange. Mary always thanked people by name. Always. Caleb unfolded his napkin before opening the sandwich. Not absent-mindedly. Carefully, neatly. Exactly the way John had done at every family dinner since he was a teenager. John felt his throat tighten. A few minutes later, someone pushing a cleaning cart rolled an old country song into the hallway from a portable radio. Without realizing it, Caleb began tapping the rhythm against the arm of the couch. One finger, then another. The exact rhythm John always tapped against the steering wheel during long drives. John looked at his own hand. He'd been doing the same thing against his knee. Emma noticed. "So Mom was right." John looked up. "About what?" "You do that too." He couldn't answer. There were too many moments now. Too many pieces. None of them proved anything by themselves. Together, they formed something impossible to ignore. These weren't habits children accidentally invented. These were stories lived often enough to become routines. Mary hadn't erased him. She had carried him into their home in the only way she knew how. Not through photographs, not through bitterness, through ordinary memories. Emma carefully folded the empty sandwich wrapper before placing it back inside the paper bag. She looked at John with the same cautious honesty Mary used to have whenever she asked a difficult question. "Can I ask you something?" He nodded. "Were you looking for us?" The room became very still. John looked from Emma to Caleb, then down at his hands. When he finally answered, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I didn't know you existed." Emma nodded slowly. "I know." She wasn't disappointed. She wasn't accusing him. She simply accepted the answer because it matched everything her mother had spent years teaching them. Good people don't always leave. Sometimes they simply never get the chance to stay. A gentle knock interrupted the silence. Denise opened the door. "Mr. Carter." She hesitated, seeing the three of them sitting together. "Mary's awake." John stood immediately. He looked back at the children. Neither of them asked him not to go. Emma simply smiled, a small, nervous smile that reminded him so much of Mary that it almost hurt. For the second time that day, John found himself walking toward a door that would change everything he thought he knew about his own life. John stopped outside Mary's hospital room. His hand rested on the door handle longer than it needed to. 8 years. He had imagined this meeting more times than he could count. Sometimes she apologized. Sometimes he did. Sometimes they argued. Sometimes neither of them spoke. None of those versions had included a hospital bed or children waiting down the hall. He took one slow breath and walked in. Mary was awake. She looked smaller than he remembered, her hair pulled back loosely and 4 taped to her hand. The heart monitor beside her bed kept a steady rhythm that somehow made the silence feel even louder. She turned her head. Their eyes met. Neither of them smiled. Neither of them cried. They simply looked at each other, as if both were trying to reconcile the person in front of them with the memory they'd carried for years. Mary spoke first. "You came." John let out a breath that almost sounded like a laugh. "They said you asked for me. I wasn't sure you would. I almost didn't answer the phone." She nodded faintly. "I know." Another quiet settled over the room. John pulled a chair closer, but didn't sit immediately. "I met them." Mary's eyes searched his face. "How are they?" "They're worried about you." A small smile crossed her face. "That sounds like them." John finally sat down. "They're good kids." "They are." They thanked the nurse by name. Mary looked down at the blanket. "I used to tell them you did that." John swallowed. "Caleb taps country songs on the furniture." "I know. And Emma folds napkins before she eats." Mary smiled again, this time with tears beginning to gather. "I forgot about the napkins." John shook his head. "You didn't forget me." The words hung between them. Mary looked out the window before answering. "I didn't know how to." Neither tried to fill the silence. For the first time in years, they didn't have to guess what the other was thinking. John reached into his jacket pocket and took out his phone. "I need to ask you something." She nodded. "Why didn't you tell me?" Mary looked at him for a long moment. "I thought I did." His forehead creased. "What do you mean?" "I wrote you a letter." John blinked. "A letter?" "The day I left." "I never got a letter." She frowned. "I mailed it. I checked my mailbox every day." "I waited for your reply." "I didn't know there was anything to reply to." Neither spoke. The confusion on their faces was almost identical. Mary looked away first. "I explained everything. The pregnancy. The hospital. I told you I loved you." Her voice caught briefly. "And that I was leaving because I thought I was making your life easier." John stared at her. "My phone was destroyed during the playoff game." She looked back at him. "What?" "I didn't hear your voicemails." "I didn't even know you'd been hospitalized until your old neighbor mentioned it days later." Mary closed her eyes. "I thought you were avoiding me. I thought you disappeared." She covered her mouth with trembling fingers. "My mother." John began slowly. "She said she visited you." Mary nodded. "She brought soup." He looked relieved for a moment. "Then she told me you weren't ready." John's head came up immediately. "No." Mary frowned. "She said she worried about me working too much." "I know. I remember that conversation." He leaned forward. "But she would never have wanted you to leave." Mary's eyes filled. "I know that now. I didn't then." John rested both hands on his knees. "I spent months looking for you." She looked stunned. "What?" "I drove to your apartment. I talked to your neighbors. I asked everyone who knew you. You searched for months." Mary slowly shook her head, as if rejecting something her heart wanted to believe. "I thought." "I know," he nodded. "You thought I'd chosen not to come. And you thought I'd chosen to leave." Neither of them had been wrong about the silence, only about what it meant. John leaned back in the chair and let out a long breath. "It's unbelievable." Mary gave a tired smile. "It sounds unbelievable because it's true." He almost laughed. Instead, he looked toward the doorway where the hallway beyond led to Emma and Caleb. "I've missed 8 years." Mary followed his gaze. So have I. He looked back at her. What do you mean? I missed watching you become their father. That sentence hurt more than any accusation could have. John lowered his head. Neither of them had been abandoned. Neither had stopped loving the other. They had simply lived inside different versions of the same story. A gentle knock interrupted them. Denise stepped inside carefully. I'm sorry to interrupt. It's okay, Mary said. The nurse looked at John. There's someone asking for you in the lobby. John frowned. Who? Denise hesitated. A woman named Rebecca. The room fell silent again. For the first time since arriving at the hospital, John remembered the church, the guests, the vows. The woman who had been waiting at the altar while he drove toward a life he never knew had always been his. John found Rebecca sitting alone in the hospital cafeteria. She had changed out of her wedding dress. Now she wore jeans, one of John's old sweatshirts she'd apparently grabbed from the church after someone brought her his overnight bag, and her engagement ring was still on her left hand. She looked exhausted, not angry, just exhausted. When she saw him, she stood. Neither of them knew whether to hug, so they didn't. I'm sorry, John said. Rebecca gave a small nod. I know. Those two words hurt more than if she had shouted. She picked up the paper cup in front of her, then realized it was empty and set it back down. I kept thinking something terrible must have happened. John sat across from her. It did. She looked at him. I know, the nurse explained. He lowered his eyes. I didn't know Mary had children. Rebecca smiled sadly. I believe you. I didn't know they were mine. I believe that too. He rubbed both hands together. I should have called. You should have. I couldn't think. I know. There it was again. Not accusation, truth. Rebecca leaned back in her chair. When I got to the hospital, I saw you through the waiting room window. John looked up. You were sitting with them. He didn't answer. They looked comfortable beside you. His voice was barely audible. They didn't know who I was until today. Rebecca nodded slowly. But they looked like they'd been waiting for you anyway. Silence settled between them. Finally, she asked the question neither of them had wanted to say out loud. Do you still love her? John didn't answer immediately. He looked through the cafeteria window toward the parking garage. I never stopped caring what happened to her. Rebecca waited. And today? He swallowed. Today, I found out I have 2 children who grew up believing I was a good man. His voice broke. I don't know how to walk away from that. Rebecca closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them again, there were tears she didn't bother hiding. You know what I think. He looked at her. I think the man I agreed to marry is sitting exactly where he needs to be. John stared at her. I don't mean beside Mary. She shook her head. I mean beside those children. She slowly removed her engagement ring. She didn't slide it across the table. She simply held it in her palm. I can't ask you to spend the rest of your life wondering what kind of father you could have been. John covered his face with one hand. I'm so sorry. I know. Rebecca reached across the table and gently squeezed his wrist. Don't turn me into the villain in this story. He looked at her. You didn't leave me. She smiled through tears. Life interrupted us. She stood. So go meet your children. Then, before walking away, she added softly, and don't disappear from them the way life disappeared from you. John watched her leave. Some goodbyes don't end because love runs out. They end because love changes direction. The first few weeks felt awkward in ways nobody could prepare for. John didn't know whether to hug the children when he arrived or wave from the doorway. Emma solved that problem by hugging him first. Caleb pretended not to care, then waited by the window every Saturday morning to see if John's truck turned into the driveway. John noticed. He always arrived 10 minutes early. He learned quickly that fatherhood wasn't built through dramatic moments. It lived inside ordinary ones, helping Caleb with multiplication homework, listening while Emma explained a science project in far more detail than necessary, burning pancakes one Saturday because he'd been too busy talking to the children to notice the stove. Caleb took one bite. These are terrible. John laughed. I know. Emma smiled. We'll eat cereal. Mary stood at the kitchen sink, watching the three of them clean up the mess together. She didn't interrupt. She simply noticed something she'd imagined 1,000 times, but had never expected to witness. John belonged there, not because biology said so, because he kept showing up. There were difficult days, too. One afternoon, Caleb became angry after losing a baseball game. "You don't get to tell me what to do." The words landed harder than Caleb intended. John stood quietly for a moment, then nodded. "You're right." Caleb blinked. "I've missed 8 years." John looked down before meeting his eyes again. "I don't get to pretend I was here." The boy's shoulders dropped. "But," John continued, "I'd like the chance to earn it." Caleb didn't answer. That evening, while John was loading sports equipment into his truck, the front passenger door opened. Caleb climbed in without asking. "You coming?" John looked surprised. "Where?" "You said we were practicing batting." John smiled. "I did." Caleb shrugged. "Well?" He buckled his seatbelt. "I'm waiting." Mary watched the truck pull away from the porch. Her mother stepped beside her. "How are you holding up?" Mary smiled without taking her eyes off the road. "I think we're all learning." Trust didn't return because someone apologized. It returned because every week John came back. Spring arrived carrying the kind of warm afternoons that invited people outside. Mary's strength had returned slowly after surgery. The doctors were pleased. The children were happier. Life no longer revolved around hospital appointments. One Saturday, John suggested a drive. "I want to show you somewhere." Emma looked up from the back seat. "Is it a surprise?" "It is." They drove toward Savannah, past familiar streets, past Forsyth Park, then into a neighborhood neither Mary nor John had visited in years. John parked along the curb. Mary looked through the windshield. Immediately she recognized the house, the modest brick home with the front porch, the one they had once stopped to admire after getting engaged. It looked different now. Fresh paint, flower beds, a new swing hanging from the porch ceiling. Emma and Caleb were already climbing out of the truck. "Can we race?" Caleb shouted. "Only to the mailbox." Mary called after them. The children sprinted down the sidewalk laughing. John and Mary stayed where they were. Neither spoke for a while. Finally, John smiled. "I still have that notebook." Mary laughed softly. "The one with all the renovation plans?" "And terrible drawings." "I like the drawings." He looked toward the children. "I used to wonder what happened to the future we planned." Mary followed his gaze. "So did I." Another quiet settled between them. Not uncomfortable, simply honest. "We can't get those years back," John said. "No, but we don't have to lose the ones we still have." Mary turned toward him. For the first time since the hospital, she reached over and took his hand. Neither of them called it a fresh start. It wasn't. Too much life had happened. Too much had been lost. What they had now wasn't the future they once imagined beneath the oak trees. It was something humbler, something harder, something earned. Across the sidewalk, Caleb shouted that Emma had cheated. Emma argued that she had not. John laughed. Mary shook her head. "They're going to do that forever." "I hope so." He looked at the children, then at Mary. Sometimes love survives not because people never let each other go, but because, even after years of silence, they never stopped believing the other person's heart was worth finding again. And from that day forward, they stopped trying to recover the family they had lost. Instead, they chose to build the ones still waiting for them,